when I do. What prompted this particular session was we had one scheduled in San Mateo in early October. Long story short is my flight got canceled, so I didn't make it. At that time, we kind of agreed it would be good to try to have something scheduled online to make up for the fact that I missed that particular session. That was a month and a half ago, so it doesn't really seem like much of a makeup anymore. But between my schedule and TAP's, this was kind of the best possible time to be able to bring us both on. So I'll encourage you for questions. Again, the main point of this was just for Q&A, particularly for those folks that were at the San Mateo session, though I don't see too many of you that really fit that bill. It looks more just like a random distribution, which of course is fine. But if you have any specific questions, let me know. There is a little PowerPoint, that's kind of some sessions I've done here over the last month or so, a couple that I intend to do here, over the next couple weeks. Again, kind of my half of the session that I'll follow in the absence of questions. So I'll just encourage you to throw questions via chat. I will open it up right this moment. Does anybody have any questions right off the get-go? I guess I'll take that one as a no. I guess people are just kind of looking for going along for the ride. So what this is we'll talk about the big changes. I'm sure a lot of you have heard here over the last couple months. There are some pretty significant changes to CAEP data collection here this year. So I will go over the major changes. There's a bunch of stuff that Neil brings up related to NOVA and fiscal reporting. I will not do that. But there's a bunch of stuff that I do to follow up on this in terms of data that I will do. So if nobody has any questions, I'll be summarizing kind of the wholesale changes this year, and then I'll transition into how that fits into, day-to-day data collection. So for starters, here's a summary of the changes. We'll start with that workforce reentry program. Workforce reentry is now going to be called workforce preparation. That also brings about some issues to that CAEP program hours report. So that kind of is the last bullet, as you would report those hours in NOVA. We had reentry as a derived field, the last couple years. That is, if learners had certain barriers to employment and or they were 55 years of age, they would automatically be considered reentry. Many people pointed out, why that really didn't make any sense. So we're basically admitting that didn't make sense and moving on to not making it a derived field anymore. So because it's not a derived field, we're now calling it workforce prep. Service hours, we're not really going to be doing that anymore. More on that here in a minute. But about half the state really thought it was a good idea to do that last year. Half the state thought it was a dumb idea. Long story short is, we did have a lot of discussion on this over the summer, decided that it wasn't that good of an idea. We'll record barriers. Chances are highly likely you're all doing barriers to employment anyway. I've been saying that's been a big measure of success, that without it being required, I'd say 90-95% of the state has been recording that vigorously. So bottom line is, now it's officially required. There's also a few things related to barriers that used to affect your data and now don't. A couple of things that, now do, so a little bit more on that. Looking at the federal side, there's a new federal measurable skills gain called passage of an exam. It's not really new. Probably the better way to describe it is there used to be a federal level measurable skills gain called skills progression. About a year ago, the feds changed that skills progression outcome to passage of an exam. So I'll go over a little bit how that's being changed at the federal level. It seems a little bit pie in the sky, but bottom line is because they changed that MSG at the federal level, there was a feeling that some of the things we do in CAEP, specifically occupational skills gain and workforce prep outcome, are now a little bit different. So because the feds changed that at the federal level, we decided that we would change it for CAEP reporting. We'll get more into that also. And then the NOVA program reporting, Neil really gets into Nova, so I'm not going to talk about the website at all. That's more Neil's department. But I will talk about specifically some of the evolutions you've had to do to report program hours in Nova. So you did that in February. You did that again September 1. You'll be doing it again December 1. The ones you did in February and September were more in the old rules. So we'll point out how these rules changes, potentially will affect that Nova reporting. Long story short is the Nova reporting for program hours you needed to do on September 1, we intentionally kept all the rules for 1819 intact so you could report it based on 1819 rules. You have another Nova requirement due December 1. Equally intentionally, we made all those changes from 1819 to 1920 prior to that next round, so we'll point out how the new program hours might differ a little bit from the old program hours. So anyway, hopefully that all makes sense. I don't see any questions, so I'll just keep going with it here. So for the program areas, one big thing is at the state level, we're now looking at there being 5 official CAEP programs instead of 7. To backpedal vociferously, the way you record instructional program at the agency level, quite frankly, exactly the same as last year. There shouldn't be any changes, but just know when we get to state level reporting, we're at 5 official programs rather than 7. The difference here is with CTE is the state level decision is CTE is now what you might call an umbrella program. That is, CTE includes CTE, short-term CTE, workforce preparation, and pre-apprenticeship. We had that broken down before, but now we're considering that one umbrella program. So that is CTE, pre-apprenticeship, and workforce prep are all rolled up into one program. And then again, we changed re-entry to workforce preparation. That is a title change in TE. It's a title change in MIS. So we're now calling that workforce preparation. And like I said, it's no longer automatically assigning students that program like it was before. So here, this is just explaining what I just said. So CTE is obviously the same as always, but it's also now including short-term CTE, workforce prep, and pre-apprenticeship. And again, we're changing re-entry. That's kind of reiterating what we said. A related issue now, this is a state level issue, but not really that, affecting you too much at the agency level, is we will be looking at breaking down adults served by participants. That is, we'll be looking at those with 0 hours versus those with 1 to 11 hours versus those with 12 or more hours. There's been an increased interest at the state level on looking at those who have more than 12 or less than 12. More specifically, there's been an increased state interest in breaking down those that have 0 hours, that is, those that make the report but don't really enroll in any particular instructional program and thereby don't accrue any hours, versus those that do enroll in one of the official programs but just don't happen to make it to 12 or more hours. So I bring this up that this is not the reason, but it's one reason why we decided against service hours is, again, we know we have service-only students. We consider those 100% different than those who enroll in a program but just don't get the 12 hours. So we're distinguishing those that just receive services versus those that do enroll in an official program but just may not necessarily get to 12 hours. So we're going to have 3 official buckets rather than 2. Up to now, we've really just looked at those with 12 or more hours and thereby eligible for outcomes and eligible for WIOA and all that kind of stuff versus those that aren't. When we're looking at those that aren't, we're going to further break down those that have 1 to 11 hours versus 0. Okay, so again, this is just repeating what I just said. We've got service-only students, they're at orientation, they just receive counseling or whatever, versus those that enroll in a program but don't get to 12, versus those that do get 12 or more and thereby qualify for CAEP outcomes. I haven't heard from anybody yet, so just to make sure, because I can't see anybody, so to make sure I'm not just talking at a wall here, I guess I'll ask, is everybody still with me? Have I lost everybody, or is everybody just listening intently? Everybody's mesmerized, no questions. So, okay, thanks enough that I'll just say, I'll assume it's the latter category. Okay, we'll keep moving. So moving on to instructional hours. So we basically aligned our collection of hours more blow by blow according to how Octay or the feds defines hours. That's again moving into the why we're not collecting service hours. So we can't commingle service hours with instructional hours. So I'll start just with this. I won't read this word for word, but bottom line is this is just copycatting the way the feds define instructional hours. I'll just say this is the main rationale that we've been using to say we are not including service hours. So to be clear, yes, we are still strongly encouraging you to collect those short-term services when you do counseling or provide special trainings or whatever. We're still saying yes, please do record those. We still are saying yes, that's definitely something as opposed to nothing. It's a really good idea to record it. We want to be able to track the fact that you're doing those activities with students to justify the funding, to show exactly what you're doing, because we do know that's a lot of extra stuff you're doing at agencies. However, we're saying we're not collecting service hours, and again, we're using this definition as the main rationale for that decision. The long story short is when you're recording hours of instruction for any student, those hours should directly relate to the instructional program. So you might say if you're providing an hour of legal counseling or fiscal counseling or whatever to the student, that's 125% fantastic. However, that has absolutely nothing to do with that person's ABE instruction or ESL instruction and so on. So thereby those hours should not be commingled with those hours that the student is getting in the instructional program. The hours you record should directly relate to the hours of instruction. So here's the federal definition that kind of backs up what we said with the link if you want to look that up yourself. So again, we're not tracking service hours. I just gave you the rationale. What I do really go way out of my way to reiterate here, though, is that when you look at this federal definition, some are construing that to mean classroom hours. So to be clear, yes, it's understood most of this is going to be in the classroom, but to be clear, this is not saying that all hours must be traditional classroom hours. I'll just say if you're doing alternative ways of instructional delivery, like distance learning, independent study, you're doing stuff in a computer lab, you're deciding CTE should be in a workshop, not in a classroom, all of those things that you're doing, I'll just say, not only are those okay, those are still very strongly encouraged. It's understood a lot of your instruction is going to be outside the traditional classroom. Everybody's still encouraged to try to provide more creative ways of delivering instruction outside the traditional classroom. So to be clear, this is not saying you must have all the hours in the classroom. It's just saying you must allot all of those hours and relate all of those hours to the individual's instructional program. So that's, again, hence the no service hours. So again, we're tracking services, but not the hours. Again, we're saying we're looking at contacts. We're looking at type of service delivered. Most of the service documentation we're doing is from Title I. There's not a big issue with hours there. It's really more about where it's delivered and how it's delivered, not with the hours. So we're keeping it consistent with how, it's typically done for WIOA. Okay, so I'll stop there and move on to the next subject. It still relates to hours, but we're talking a little bit more with program hours. So one big CAEP program hours change, like I said, is the fact that CTE now is an umbrella program including multiple programs. another with how we're relating hours that might stem from more than one program. So backtracking to the fire drill we did last February, that is the very first time we did CAEP program hours reporting in NOVA, there were a lot of issues with how those hours were displayed in software. I'd say, quite frankly, ourselves included, up until about the 1st of February or so. A big issue with us, which was the same issue with just about everybody else, was the way that we handled hours when you had a class with more than one program. So to be clear, a lot of you are recording more than one program to a class. If you're doing that, I'll go way out of my way to say, no, you're not doing anything wrong. In fact, there's what I'll call card-carrying examples where people like me and others are saying, yeah, there's specific situations where it might be a good idea to relate more than one program to a class. The obvious example is if you're doing integrated education and training, there's a lot of card-carrying examples where we're saying you might want to consider assigning that class to both CTE and ESL simultaneously. So if you're doing that, again, you've been encouraged to do that for the last 2 years or so. So in any case, though, for CAEP program hours, that created a bit of a conundrum because you had more than one program. What was happening with TE and pretty much all other systems is that it was double dipping. So if you had CTE and ESL, those hours were depositing into CTE. Simultaneously, they were also depositing into ESL. So at that point, there were a lot of double dipping issues. Sometimes I still hear about double dipping issues when you're comparing different systems and how it reconciles the hours. I'll just say what we did in TE back in February for that first NOVA reporting exercise is we just made a command decision to say, okay, we're going to just arbitrarily split those hours 50-50. With the long story short being, if you assign more than one program to a class, it's feasible to split those hours. However, to make it work, you've got to split those hours exactly the same way for all classes. So at that time, the most sensible example for us seemed to be split everything 50-50. So I'll just say in February, that was a command decision on our end that really had no connection with state policy at all. It was just so we had a way to split those hours as opposed to no way at all. Subsequently, the state has decided it agrees that there really isn't a perfect way to do this, but 50-50 is as good as any and makes the most sense of any. So just know whenever you're assigning more than one program to a class, by definition, you're saying that class should be split 50-50. So in this example, if you're doing IET, half the hours will go to CTE for CAEP program hours, the other half will go to ESL. So if that's your intent, you can assign more than one program to the class and do nothing else. Everything will be fine. But I'll just say, if you know deep down the way you really intended it was, say, 70% ESL and 30% CTE, that's fine, but then you've got to go out of your way to create the two separate class records and then carefully allocate the hours. In my example, putting 70% of the hours in the ESL class and the other 30% in the CTE class. If you leave it with more than one program, it will not split those hours correctly. So I'll just say, here's a good sanity check time. Everybody still hanging in there. Everybody follow me. Again, I can't see you when I'm going off on ridiculous tangents, I'm sure. So I'm not sure if anybody's following me, if I'm just in J-land and in a universe of my own self here. Okay, everybody's saying you can follow. So, okay, wonderful. We'll move on. Okay, so moving on. Again, this is just reiterating what I just said, where if you want to assign more than one program in a class, again, the official policy is to split it 50-50. And then here's just a screenshot in TE that just shows you the example of where you might have more than one program in a class. Here's an IET class where you're marking it as both ESL and CTE. Okay, so moving on to the next big change, we're looking at occupational, or we're looking at passage of an exam. So that's a little bit more of a long story short, short story long here, where we'll go to this one here, where there's a MSG, or measurable skills gain, at the federal level that we've had called skills progression that has now been changed to passage of an exam. So maybe TMI, but the way it's set up is, you've got those 5 federal measurable skill gains, pre-post, secondary, post-secondary. Those are the ones that we know well for Title II. There are 2 other MSGs that usually are more Title I than Title II. One is called training milestone. The other has been called skills progression. The skills progression was the one where Title I agencies could mark for workforce program students whenever the student maybe wasn't at program long enough to get the occupational licensure, wasn't in the program long enough to actually get the job or the pay raise, but had been in program and nonetheless had still been doing a great job in program. So if that was the case for the student, there was a skills progression MSG, those programs could mark to show, yeah, the student hasn't gotten the job yet, they haven't been certified yet, but they have made significant progress in their work, in their vocational program, so we'll give them that skills progression MSG so we can still document that that student is doing a great job. So the feds are still saying there's an MSG for that, but they're now changing it from skills progression to passage of an exam. They're basically saying, yeah, you can document the fact that that student is doing a great job in their program, but if you mark that as an outcome, we want you to show or demonstrate that that student passed some sort of an exam. So they're very lenient on what exactly that is. It can be a standardized test like CASAS. It can be a skills check. It could be an exam you made up at the agency that you think accurately reflects what they need to know. It can be any of those things. You can decide what the exam is, but somehow, some way, you need to show that they passed an exam. So to get the pink elephant out right away, no, this does not mean you need to CASAS test CTE students. If you want to CASAS test them, I'll point out that would be one way to make this problem go away, but no, that's not the one and only way. There's lots of ways you can address passage of an exam. Again, you can see the list here in the bullet, but again, you've got to show some kind of exam, in order to mark these outcomes. We've had all kinds of jokes and training about, gee, how are we going to mark this exam? Are the CAEP data police going to get us? And of course, we know that that chance is 1 in a million at best, probably way less than that, but we'll just have to take you on your honor that whenever you're marking any of these outcomes related to occupational skills gain or workforce prep milestone, that's now suggesting that the student passed some kind of an exam, rather than just made it from one module to the next. So I'll just say the reason why we just made the fuss to this is, again, I'm going to back up, we've got that gain called occupational skills gain. We also have that one called workforce prep milestone that we're recording in CAEP for CTE students. So at the state level, we all agree that those outcomes directly stem from that skills progression federal-wide MST. So given that it changed at the federal level, we felt like we needed to reflect that exact change at the state level for CAEP outcomes. Okay, the next big change relates to barriers to employment. So there's the screenshot. So again, I'm sure you're all probably collecting barriers at every training. Everybody raises their hand. We feel pretty strongly that this has been a big area of success because everybody's jumped on the barriers to employment bandwagon. So for whatever it's worth, it really hasn't been required until this year. But now just know barriers to employment is required. It's been met with a yawn because everybody's doing it anyway. But the bigger changes that might affect you more is there is that derived field that we used to have related to workforce reentry where certain barriers would automatically place the student in reentry. Like we said, we decided that that derived field idea ended up being a really bad idea, so we're kind of unhitching this program from those derived fields. Because we're unhitching it from that, we're changing the name from workforce reentry to workforce workforce preparation. We're also unhooking it from the 55 plus years of age. So that's one big area where barriers doesn't affect our data anymore. But we're out with the old and with the new. An area where barriers does affect it is we are automatically tying barriers to ABE, ASE, and ESL. So I'll back up a step here. Some of you may remember about a year ago, the feds came out and did a monitoring visit for the entire state of California. That was September 2018. Excuse me. Anyway, when the feds came out here last year, what they told us was they did see certain barriers from a statewide Title II perspective as automatically relating to students. The Fed said from their point of view, all WIOA Title II ABE ASE learners should automatically be low levels of literacy students. Similar, they thought all WIOA Title II ESL learners should automatically be considered low English literacy students. So we did take their advice. We didn't make the changes until July 1 when we were moving to the next program year, but just know by definition, and we passed the love for both WIOA 2 in California as well as CAEP reporting in California. So all ABE ASE learners are automatically going to be assigned that low levels of literacy barrier. Similarly, all ESL learners will automatically be given that low English literacy learner, or you can see on the list it's actually English language learner. So those are both barriers. So we're basically automatically giving barriers to those in ABE and ESL respectively based on the Fed's advice to us, 1 year ago. I'll just stop again. Everybody following me, yes or no? I can't see anybody. I can't hear anybody. Nobody's asking any questions. So I'm going to continue to just falsely assume that means it's so crystal clear. How the heck could anybody have any stinking questions? But I just want to make sure that I'm not in J-land here. All crazy like here. All right, thank you for humoring me there. So again, this is just reiterating what I said. It's more for WIOA 2, but because we're doing it for WIOA 2, we're saying the same thing applies for CAEP. There really isn't any difference between CAEP and WIOA 2 in this instance. So we're saying all ABE, ASE are low levels of literacy, all ELL are English language learner. As an aside, there's that cultural barriers that we're not really automating in any way because it doesn't directly relate to a program like those other two do. But just as an aside, from the Fed's point of view, cultural barriers is the third barrier to employment that they would say also directly relates to all WIOA Title II learners. Okay, so again, this is the other side of it. We're not relating barriers or date of birth to workforce preparation anymore. I'll just say, to be clear, a lot of you have been reporting that, yes, you've been doing this program, you've been very happy with this program. That is, you've been running a lot of short-term workforce programs and classes for students, and students love it. So I will backpedal here to just say this rule does not preclude you from doing the program. If you're saying, hey, we've been doing this program at our agency and it's been great, by all means continue to implement this program, but just know from a data point of view, the only way learners will show up in this program is if you go out of your way to mark it, whether it's TE or whatever system, you mark workforce preparation, they'll show up as workforce prep. The only ones that will show up in this programs are the ones that you mark. You won't get any of those unpleasant surprises based on barriers or date of birth like you used to. Okay, so switching gears here, we're right at the halfway point. I think that covers all the changes, so just to dig in the data a little deeper, to some extent to explain some of the changes, to some extent just to explain the data framework overall. Here's kind of some reminders. This is showing how we are aligning, the federal, performance indicators and measurable skills gains to our 6 areas of AB 104. Again, we've got performance indicators and measurable skill gains at the federal level. And sorry, I'll back up here. And we've got the 6 areas of AB 104 at the state level. So just to reiterate, at the federal level, we have performance indicators, which I would call final prize outcomes. That's things like get a job, get a pay raise, enter college, basically all those things, get a licensure. That is all the things that we would say, are final prize outcomes that you can hang your hat on. Then we also have measurable skills gains. That is things that, maybe we're carving out, things like pre and post testing, where, we're basically carving out a way to be able to still document that our students are doing a great job. Making a long story short here is when we look at performance indicators like get a job or earn your diploma or whatever, everybody says, yeah, these are outstanding outcomes. Nobody quibbles with this at all. However, if we rely on performance indicators and only that, where a lot of people will quibble is say, yeah, these are all great outcomes, but if we only have performance indicators, there's a lot of students that maybe haven't been in program long enough to get a job or to enter college or get their GED or whatever. So we need to have other outcomes that we're documenting for students that still show that our students are doing a great job. So the obvious one is pre and post testing, where you might say, hey, our ESL or ABE student hasn't been long enough to get a job or complete their diploma, but they have been around long enough to show they've been doing a bang-up job on their CASAS pre and post test. So we're using that for CAEP. We know now that in CAEP we've got students in programs like CTE and workforce prep that is outside of WIOA 2, so we know if we rely exclusively on pre and post testing, that'll be great for some of the students, but still won't get it all the students. So when we looked at our CAEP outcomes, we knew we had to carve out yet more measurable skills gains beyond just pre and post testing. So we had MSGs for all programs, not just the pre and post testing we have for ABE and ESL. So that's a humongous mouthful. Is everybody still following me? Yes or no? I know I'm being irritating by asking that, but because it's such a ridiculous mouthful, I just want to make sure I'm not losing. Okay, you're jumping in. Great. Thank you for humoring me on that. So again, the goal was we had to look at all these measurable skills gains for all programs and align them to the 6 areas of AB 104. So again, moving on to state level, when we started with, really AB 86, we came up with these 6 areas. We didn't just make them up. We used these 6 areas because the legislature specifically stipulated in legislation called AB 104 that we would be reporting all of our outcomes in these 6 categories. So I'll just say 5 of them related exactly to what we already had in the federal system. There was one of them called transition that was a little bit different, that the legislature specifically called out as an additional area, but I point out number 1, how we had to carve out our outcomes to meet the demands of the legislature. I'll point out number 2, that the legislature didn't really make this up either. The legislature just listed out what the feds had already spelled out pretty, blatantly. The legislature wanted to have us mimic the federal system, so I'll just say not so coincidentally when it laid out these areas in AB 104, not so coincidentally the areas it laid out matched almost word for word what the feds had already required us to do in things like WIOA. Okay, Master. Okay, I'll hold off. Well, let's move. So hold on just a sec. Let me just tie this together. So when we were looking at the areas of AB 104, again, we had those 6 categories represented by these 6 specific boxes you can see right here. So again, what we did is we just identified the specific outcomes that relate to each of those 6 areas of AB 104. So moving on here, what this is just showing is again, the whole specific titles we're using, from the update record or from the software, I'll just admit are arbitrary. Is again, we had to come up with some way to relate the bubbles on the update record, or if you prefer, the checkboxes in the software. For some of you, that's, marking it directly into TE. For some of you, that's marking it directly in other software systems. But the quite frankly here is whether you're talking about TE, whether you're talking about, community college MIS, or you're talking about any other system, we already had all of these bubbles or checkboxes or whatever you wanted to call them already included in TE, already included in community college MIS, already included in pretty much all the other data systems. So we had lots of bubbles and checkboxes. So the decision we made was, instead of creating a bunch more bubbles and or a bunch more checkboxes, we aligned it to the bubbles and checkboxes we already had. Some of this was just we felt like we already had way too many bubbles and checkboxes. Some of that was just to make sure that all the systems were aligned. It was really to include all systems were in alignment, but specifically we needed to make sure that community college MIS and TOPS Enterprise were aligned, because those are of course the systems we're using for official CAEP reporting. That is, all K-12s are using TOPS Enterprise, all community colleges are using community college MIS, so we definitely need an alignment with those two systems. Unofficially, we needed to make sure that those two systems were aligned to everything else, so we made command decisions based on a lot of bubbles and checkboxes that were added to TE and other systems because of WIOA, and we basically did that alignment. So Mastered Course Competencies is aligned to the CDCP certificate. To be clear, that's a college-based course completion. That's what we aligned at the time. I'll just say, I assume you're asking that because you're scratching your head. Why did you choose that specific bubble or that specific checkbox? I'll just say that one and skills progression don't really make a lot of sense now, but we had to align it, in a lot of ways. Some really make sense now. Some don't make a lot of sense here 2 or 3 years later. What I'd just say is there's a lot of those that, I'd scratch my head too, but for now anyway, we're leaving it the same. I guess I'll just say that quite frankly, there is a lot of these seem kind of whack now 3 years later, now that we understand we owe a little bit better now than we did 3 years ago. But the feeling is, even though it is kind of wacky now, and you're pointing out a good example of the aforementioned wackiness, then I guess we're just still thinking that changing any of this, to make it to have it make more sense just seems a little bit wackier than just living with the fact that some of these definitions don't make sense, given that we've disseminated these bubble boy slides to the nth degree. Everybody's got it all memorized, so now changing it now when people finally got the hang of it just seems a little crazier. That said, next year we might have to change this a little bit, because we have been looking at, introducing new outcomes for things like K-12 success and so on. We understand there's big pockets of potential outcomes that we haven't even introduced yet or made any decisions on yet. So next year, I'd say really good chance that that's coming, with things like, immigration coming. There's a lot of new things that we're going to have to introduce to the field, like it, whether we like it or not, or you like it or not. So that might precipitate a wholesale change. If so, we might try to change some of these. I've got to say, I'm surprised you asked Mastered Course Competencies, because I'd argue Mastered Course Competencies is still a pretty good correlation to what we really mean by CDC certificate. But I'll just say, getting in the weeds to the nth degree, the skills progression is the one that really makes no sense. That's where I admit we really do look dumb. But again, I guess we're saying we'd rather look dumb and leave it the same, so we're not monkey wrenching with it, as opposed to looking smart and having everybody confused because we changed all these handouts or whatever. So way TMI there, but hey, you asked, so there's the most obnoxious TMI answer we'll get for this session, and I'll dare say that's saying something. Anyway, I'll move out of that. Anyway, just to explain this is just to link, the different outcomes, from a checkbox or bubble perspective to, what it means in terms of CAEP land. Just to flesh out some of these, you can see we've got pre-post. The second one is the one called Carnegie units, or more. It's also called high school credits. So here's what we mean by Carnegie units or high school credits. That is, one big way to show gains is by pre-post testing. An alternative, you might say, is through high school credits. So specifically for high school diploma students, you might want to mark high school credits. I'll just say this is designed for those high school diploma students that might be too high for CASAS testing. If you do high school diploma, you probably know what I'm talking about. Inevitably, you're going to have certain students that pre-test at like 250 something or whatever at CASAS. That is, they're too high for those federal levels. You know right away they're going to have a 0% chance of making any kind of level completion in the federal system. That is, certain high school students are just too high for CASAS. They were probably referred to you for reasons other than skill deficit, quite frankly. So some of those students are going to score really high on CASAS. Once they do, that you still serve them, but in terms of gains, you're not really going to be able to document much for them. So if they get really high, here's an alternative way for you to document, some sort of gain for them where you can use high school credits instead of testing. So what we're saying is the federal definition, you're showing that they progress from the 9th or 10th grade level upon enrollment to the 11th or 12th grade level sometime lower in the year based on high school credits. So for example, I'll just say the what if here is, we'll just pretend your agency requires 200 credits to get the diploma. That's not everybody's number, but I'll say, yeah, that's a pretty common number for a lot of districts. So if your district requires 200 credits to graduate, then I would suggest your magic number is 100 credits. That is the halfway point of 200. So in that example, if the student starts the year below 100 credits, that would suggest they're starting the year at the 9th or 10th grade level. If they complete the level above 100 credits, that would suggest they're finishing at the 11th or 12th grade level. So this screenshot is just showing you the workaround in TE where you can document that they made gains through high school credits. That is, you can use that self-reported level. In this case, you're marking them ASE low at the start of the year and ASE high later in the year. That is from the 9th or 10th grade level to the 11th or 12th grade. I admit this is confusing, but I'll just say the confusion here is necessary. There is a place in TE where you can record the specific number of credits the student has, but I'll just say because all you districts have a mind of your own and use a slightly different number of credits for high school graduation, we know that using that credits field will not work. If everybody required the same number of credits, it would work, but knowing that nothing could be further from the truth, we need this workaround using self-reported levels. So I'm making a big deal about this one because this is definitely one where we've gotten the highest number of questions. Okay, so just moving along here, another one that gets a lot of questions is occupational skills gain and workforce prep milestone. So to Janie's question, here's the bubbles you can mark for that occupational skills gain outcome. Here's the one you can mark for the work preparation outcome. And again, this is like to Janie's question with the CDCP certificate. This is just arbitrary. These are the ones that we picked 3 years ago, so we're sticking with it. The more common question related to workforce prep outcome and occupational skills gain is less about what to check or bubble and more about what the heck is the difference between the two at a program level. So there's no definitive answer, but I'll just say this is my answer, so you have some answer instead of none at all. So what we've been saying for the last couple years is mark occupational skills gain when the student accomplishes a portion of a longer term program, mark workforce prep outcome if there's full completion of a shorter term program. So for occupational skills gain, the example is we have a welding student. We're just making this example up, but we'll just say there's a welding program that's 5 modules long or 5 semesters. So we'll just say in this example, the student completes module 1, they do a great job, they're ready to move into module 2. So once the student makes it out of module 1 and successfully transition into module 2, we're saying that's an occupational skills gain. That's partial completion of a longer term program. So doubling back to that passage of an exam, it's the exact same outcome, but in this case we're saying they move out of module 1 into module 2, and now you're having them pass some kind of an exam. Again, maybe you're just CASAS testing, maybe it's a skills check, maybe it's just an informal exam you made up at your own agency, but we're now saying instead of just moving from one to the next, we're saying, yeah, they passed some kind of an exam to move from module 1 to module 2. Workforce prep outcome, we'll just say it's a 15-hour class on job search strategies. So it's a short-term, workforce prep class or something like that. They do the 15-hour class. They're still alive at the end of the 15 hours. So great, they completed the class. So that would be an example of where you would mark workforce prep outcome. That is full completion of a short-term program. I'm just going to stop here. Another pulse check. Is everybody hanging in there, yes or no? Okay, thank you for humoring me. Everybody sounds like they are. So we'll move along. So the next question relates to post-secondary. So, okay, we're looking at these CTE-related measurable skills gains, and we've successfully defined the difference between workforce prep outcome and occupational skills gain. So we're moving on to the next question is, what's the definition or what's the distinction between those two CTE measurable skills gains versus when does it rise to the level of a post-secondary outcome? So, we had lots of discussion a few years ago in the training Neil and I do about, hey, when do they actually get their occupational certificate or licensure? That is, when does it really qualify as an occupational completion versus when is it something smaller than that? And we looked at 48 hours, we looked at, things like Perkins and the ETPO and, different ways of measuring when is it a full-scale outcome. So what we're saying is we consider it a literacy gain, that is occupational skills gain or workforce prep milestone. Again, partial completion of a longer-term program or full completion of a shorter-term program. We're saying it rises up to the level of post-secondary when it's the full completion of that longer-term program. So in my example, they're a welding student. They complete module 1 and move to module 2. That's a great opportunity to mark occupational skills gain. Once the student completes all 5 modules in my example, that's when you mark post-secondary. That's when you mark occupational certificate or licensure. That is, you're saying not only did they make great gains in their class, but now they're officially certified to be a welder in the state of California. That's when you're marking a post-secondary outcome as opposed to just a literacy gain. Okay, hopefully everybody's still following me there. We'll move on here. So another one that's been a common question starter are those transition outcomes. So again, we're just covering the highlights. My highlights, quote unquote, are the areas in which we've been getting lots and lots of questions during trainings. So that one fire drill I just ran you through is one big question. The second one has to do with transition outcomes. That's been another confusion point. So there's 3 transitions in the CAEP system. You can transition to ASE, transition to CTE, or transition to college. We'll start with ASE. That's more a quote-unquote under-the-hood outcome. That's not anything you really need to check or bubble, but just know under the hood, if a student starts in either ABE or ESL and finishes in either HSE or high school diploma, that's considered transition to ASE. There's nothing you need to mark for that, but just know by definition, when we're at the state level under the hood, we automatically give a transition to ASE for that. That's done all automatically without you marking anything. The ones you are marking, however, are the transitions to CTE in college. You can see the specific bubbles or check boxes over there in the right-hand column. So here's the graphic we've been using to define these transitions. The picture seems to equal 1,000 words, where when we do it in laundry list, we just confuse everybody. So hopefully the graphic's a little better. So the starting point for either one of these transitions is going to be either one of these blue boxes to the left. That is, the starting point is either K-12 Adult Ed, ABE, ASE, ESL, or non-credit community college, ABE, ASE, or ESL. The transition to CTE is from either one of those start points, and they finish up at either K-12 Adult Ed CTE or community college CTE. That would obviously constitute a transition to CTE, or the student could be at either one of those starting points again, and they could move from either one of those starting points to 4-credit community college. So I'll just point out, for the college transition, we go out of our way to say it's non-credit at the start, 4-credit at the end. That is, if you're going from K-12 Adult Ed to non-credit community college, we would say that's definitely not a transition. If they're moving from K-12 Adult Ed to non-credit community college, we would say that's definitely a lateral transition, not the transition we're looking for an official outcome. That is, we're moving to 4-credit. That would be the way that they're actually advancing from point A to point B. Hopefully that makes sense, but I kind of offer that extra information at my own peril, simply because that's the aspect of this slide that generates by far the most questions. So I'll give this a mercy killing here. Sanity check. Is everybody with me? Any questions on this transition slide? Okay, everybody's saying that's okay. Don't see anybody offering anything up, so I'll just say terrific. We're in great shape here. Okay, so moving along here, just a few minutes here, but I'll just rattle off a few. So we're also looking at services. Here's the areas for services, 3 categories: supportive, training, and transition. So again, supportive are services that relate more to the individual's personal needs rather than their programmatic needs, childcare, transportation, and so on. The training services are more related to programmatic. It's pretty broad in the areas it can cover. I'll say transition are also related more to programmatic than personal. Transition services relate directly to some way, shape, or form to help that student transition to employment or transition to college. Okay, this slide is something we developed just to categorize the services. We're kind of providing specific examples. We've been saying over and over and over, the definitions of the services are definitely not, specific enough where you can really get this wrong, but we have been providing a lot of this categorization of services and trying to pinpoint it just to give you something instead of nothing. If you're using a slightly different lens for this, I don't really think you're in trouble, but most of you are saying you want more specificity, not less. So we're trying to get as specific as possible and trying to act like we have this super specific when the reality, of course, is we don't. But just know if you're looking for guidance, here's some case-specific examples and how you can align it to those 3 categories of supportive, transition, and training specifically. Okay, moving on a couple minutes on the CAEP summary. So again, we've got the three areas. Again, high bar to the left, middle bar in the middle, low bar to the right. Just to get on a couple new things here, in TE, these are all new things. So we've changed the nature of the setup window. Again, some report selection changes. That's what the screenshot is showing you. Some charting examples, a couple new reports called the outcome summary and service summary, and some changes to the CAEP program hours. So here's the setup window, that chart analysis. There are some graphs you can now select, and there's also different ways to show things for CAEP program hours. I guess I cut myself up at the knees here. Sorry, I'm going to focus on this part of it here because I've got 2 minutes. But I'll just show you, you can show the graphing here. If you want graphs, there's now a way to show some nifty charts and graphs. Down here, this is getting at that different ways of showing CTE, where you can show CTE as one program instead of, the multiple programs. You can do the same thing with ABE, ASE, where you can show it all, ABE and ASE as one entity versus ABE, ASE separate versus ABE, high school diploma and high school equivalency is 3 separate. Same thing for CTE. Up here, here's the box you can check if you want to show chart analysis. Sorry, I see I've got some slides I need to think about changing here a little bit. But in any case, sticking with what's new, because I think this is most useful. So what I do want to point out is that's the charting you have. That also covers some changes we made to program hours. Again, the 50-50 is a big change, and we changed up the whole area related to CTE, like I said up front. The final thing I wanted to say, and sorry, my slide selection was poor. I can give you some other slides. Email me if you want some other. Yes, if you mark it in the, if you want to just mark the category, that's fine. I'll use your question, Mina, to segue, though, that we do now have more granularity here as I'm backing up to the CAEP summary to explain the last point, for which I thought I had a slide, but I don't, is we see the CAEP summary. I'm sure you all understand it. Everybody, of course, all loves the CAEP summary. So I'll just point out everybody loves it. However, one understandable beef against it the last couple years is it just goes by category. So what I like to pick on here is the category for employment. You can see here in CAEP outcomes where employment includes 3 specific outcomes. It includes get a job, keep a job, and enter military. Those are just the ones we have for employment. So the beef is when you're looking at that column for enter employment, it gives you the aggregate of those 3. There really isn't an easy way to specifically see exactly how many got a job versus specifically how many retained a job versus specifically how many entered military. It just gives you all 3 in one big lump outcome. That's how they all do it. So I'll just say there's a way where you can right-click and drill down and get that information, but it's not that easy to do. So anyway, there's now a new report called CAEP Outcomes that gives you that level of granularity. That is, it's a really busy piece of paper, but it gives you all of the CAEP outcomes on one piece of paper and shows you exactly how many made each outcome. That is, if you generate that CAEP outcomes here, hang on, I'm going to go to this one where if you select CAEP outcomes, it will show you exactly how many got each specific outcome, so you don't have to drill down and do all those extra steps. Similarly, there's one called CAEP Services, which does the same thing, where similarly in the CAEP summary, it aggregates all those services to each services category. If you want to know, exactly how many earned each specific service, you can now get that information by looking at CAEP Services. Similarly, it's a very busy piece of paper, but it goes service by service and shows exactly how many students earned each specific CAEP service. Again, CAEP Outcomes, CAEP Services. Okay, and I think that covers, and I think that addresses your question, Mina, about services specifically. So I think I'm going to give this a mercy killing. I wanted to cover Q&A. Let's see. These are all the reference of where you can get the outcomes. Here's the data submission calendar. Here's entry record. I think all of these other things are kind of FYIs that people kind of know. I'll go through these just to make sure you don't think I'm hiding anything. I think these are big time repeats that we covered many times. So before we finalize, I'll just say, are there any questions about anything I went over? I think I covered the highlights, so we kind of went through what we needed. Hopefully there was something in there for you somehow, some way. I'm a few minutes over, so with no questions, I'll bottle it up and pass it back to Veronica here a couple minutes late.
No worries, Jay. Thank you so much. And thank you all very much for participating in today's webinar. We do appreciate your participation. I have posted the URL for Wednesday's webinar. We will have a webinar on Wednesday titled Effective Vocabulary Instruction. And so this will be a panel of vocabulary instruction subject matter experts talking about their practices and perspectives when it comes to vocabulary instruction. So if you haven't registered, please be sure to register for that webinar, as well as pass this information on to other colleagues who may be interested in participating in such a webinar. And I am pulling the URL of where this webinar recording and PowerPoint will be located on the California Adult Education website, just in case you need to access it for future reference, and also if you would like to pass it on to colleagues who were unable to participate in today's webinar. They will have an opportunity to participate as well. So that's that URL. The webinar recording and PowerPoint will be located on the California Adult Education website later on this afternoon, so please be sure to use that URL to access it. And if there are no further questions, I will close the webinar room, and when I do, an evaluation will appear. Please be sure to complete the evaluation and let Jay know what you thought of today's webinar, as well as if there are any additional technical assistance or professional development needs you have as it relates to data and accountability. We want to make sure that we provide you all with as much training and as much answers to your questions as you may have regarding data and accountability. So we want to make sure that we touch all bases. Thank you all very much for your time and your participation, and thank you, Jay, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.